The first view we'll look at is going to be the most complicated of the major views we'll be using this semester. The metaphysical grounding for this view is difficult to explain, but I'll try to give you a simplified but comprehensive explanation of it. Kant's Groundwork on the Metaphysics of Morals is one of those incredibly dense little books, up there with Wittgenstein's Tractatus. Perhaps Hegel was right. Maybe the spirit of the age was in Germany in the era he wrote the Phenomenology of Spirit. Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, they're all intellectual powerhouses, and they remain influential. But let's get to the groundwork. All of these ideas hang together, but they can't be said all at once, so the system is difficult to extract from plain text. You need to read it more than once. Kant's Groundwork is a project to show what an absolute moral theory would need to be grounded in, if such a thing were possible. But Kant seems to think such a thing is possible, and maybe even the results of this critique or investigation actually do provide the grounding for an absolute objective moral theory. Kant seems to also suggest that he's merely explaining common sense moral reasoning that will arrive at the same conclusions that we all already have and already use. Want is not equal to will on this view. Want is mere desire. Will is a faculty that deliberately determines courses of action. As for the relationship with reason, consider the question: for what reason would I want my will to be in accordance with reason? The necessity or primacy of reason is recognized in this question. The questioner just hasn't figured that out yet. The first formulation of the categorical imperative doesn't mean how would you like it if everyone did that. It means, if there is a practice X and a law Y that is universalized, in other words, always followed by everyone, everywhere, would that law for engaging in that practice contradict that practice to the point that the practice itself could no longer be a practice? The second formulation can override the results of the first formulation. In other words, if the first formulation doesn't clearly produce a contradiction, the second formulation is sufficient for prohibiting a potentially immoral action. Kantian ethics starts from the fact that nothing is good without qualification but a good will. Good is what ought to be done since reason necessitates. The good is our duty according to reason. Reason is important in moral context because, like all laws, the moral law is grounded in reason. Reason is the only thing that gives us rules or directions for accomplishing anything. It's not clear that this commits the appeal to nature fallacy, because that would mean we're saying, since reason is what gives us rules, reason ought to give us rules. However, what Kant's theory is acknowledging is that reason is the only thing that can give us rules or directions. So, it's not the same thing exactly. Now, what does that mean that reason makes the rules? People who have never studied logic will sometimes say things like, love is not logical. But, as philosophers who have studied logic, you know that statements like this are meaningless. A single statement without any logical syntax is just a statement. It can be used in a logical form or an illogical form, but as a standalone statement, it doesn't make sense. What people mean to say is, it isn't a result of logical reasoning who we fall in love with. This statement has meaning, but it doesn't mean that logic or reason is not involved in emotion-driven ventures. If you want to attract or go to your lover, you need to go through a logical sequence of steps, and reason provides these. I need to get up from my chair, get in my car, and drive to my lover. Reason dictates every step, despite the irrationality of my affections. This is what we mean when we say that reason makes the rules, or gives directions. Let's take a look at the background metaphysical argument that supports this view. The intrinsic good. A good will is the only thing with intrinsic good, that is, good without qualification. It's good in and of itself. We're autonomous, and we have reason, which makes us moral creatures. Autonomy is at the core of morality because it makes us the source of our actions, good and bad. Automatons are amoral. So, ought applies to us. Ought is revealed as required by reason. Reason dictates that we ought to pursue the good. As said before, a good will is the only thing that is good in and of itself, so, according to reason, we ought to develop a good will. It's our duty. For Kant, duty is the necessity of an action committed out of respect for the moral law. Having consequences as standards makes moral standards problematically inductive, and my logicians will appreciate this problem. As I've described, reason makes the rules. Reason provides the rules whereby I regulate myself towards action, will. Because reason is the only thing that gives us the directions for how to achieve anything, reason is also what we must use to achieve morality. Reasoning aligns my will with my duty. It allows me to produce a good will. We can see that want and will are not the same things. You can overcome wants using will or willpower. It is a higher order motivation from reason that has efficacy. Will comes from a determining and differentiating force in accordance with reason. Want is in accordance with desire. Anything done from want, instinct, or whatever is not moral. Outcomes and desires are out of our control. Our intentions are within our control, so we can be morally responsible for our intentions. Desires, inclinations, instincts, and so on are not the proper masters of the will. Only reason is the proper master of the will. Desires and inclinations are related to the individual. Reason is intertwined and maybe even identical with the moral law or the moral good. Being motivated by reason is about the same thing as saying acting from duty, which is related to having a good will. We'll see why when we get into the first articulation of the categorical imperative. There are some takeaways from this argument. The moral law is consistent, impartial, and universal reason. Being moral requires reason plus autonomy. Both statements seem true. 1, we use reason to figure out what moral actions are, and 2, reason determines what moral action is. Duty dictates that you must act out of respect for the moral law, consistency, impartiality, and the universality of reason. We have a duty to develop a good will that only moves us to act with respect for the moral law. Reason gives us the rules that are imperative to our actions. When actions are amoral, the imperatives are hypothetical. They're like if-then statements. Think modus ponens. When the actions are moral, the imperatives are categorical. Think categorical syllogisms using all, no, and some. Now, for the categorical imperative formulations, for an action to meet the first two is for the action to meet the third. So, the first formulation and the second formulation are tests for an action's moral permissibility. There are some moral propositions that emerge from this argument. The first proposition is, for an action to have moral worth, it must be done from duty. The second proposition is, an action does not get its moral worth from the purpose of the action, but from the maxim or rule it involves. The third proposition, to have a duty is to act in a certain way out of respect for the moral law. This is just a logical consequence of the first two. If we understand how all of these fit together, it might look like we're talking about one idea, like acting from duty, having a good will, how to act in accordance with the absolute universal moral laws, or acting in accordance with reason. Reason must ground morality over things like desires, inclinations, or whatever, because reason is universal. Logic works whether you like it or not. If there were going to be an absolute universal moral law, it would have to be grounded in reason. The categorical imperatives aren't actually three. There are three formulations of the categorical imperative that follow from this argument. So, if morality is going to dictate our behavior, it must be grounded in reason. For Kant, since the moral law is grounded in reason, it must be consistent, impartial, and universal, like logic. Therefore, the first logical standard of morality must be consistent, impartial, and universal in nature, which will lead us to the first formulation of the categorical imperative. The first formulation states, act only according to that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. This formulation isn't saying, what if everyone did that, like we discussed before. It's a thought experiment used to test courses of action. By will that an action become a universal law, we aren't saying that everyone has the same rule to follow. We're saying that they will follow it, like laws of physics, like gravity. In your thought experiment, you should be able to see that an action is immoral when the maxim or rule that your action reflects results in a logical contradiction. The way that looks is, an immoral act will reflect a rule that eliminates the course of action that the rule is supposed to apply to. We'll look at some examples to clarify this later. The second standard follows from what makes a moral being. Reason and autonomy are required for a moral being. Reason means we have access to moral knowledge, and autonomy means you can choose the moral over the immoral. So, we must have both. For morality to exist, moral beings must be able to choose morality over immorality. Therefore, any deterrence from reason in the decision-making process is immoral. Any deterrence from reason would disrespect the moral being's right to autonomy. Which brings us to the second formulation. So act that you use humanity in your own person as well as in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Humans are end-producing ends in themselves. Since they're autonomous and rational, and therefore moral, they ought not be inhibited on their journey of or towards moral action. Inhibiting moral action is immoral. This is called respect for dignity, dignity that all such beings rationally deserve. The third formulation states that every rational being must so act as if they were, through their maxim, always a law-making member in the universal kingdom of ends, which to me basically just means commitment to the first and second formulations. Later, we'll practice applying this theory in our section on applied ethics. From our selection, we can see that Kant is clearly a terrible writer, and that adds to the difficulty of understanding his theories. But once you read and reread his work, and it finally clicks, you'll see it's a brilliant theory. But like all the theories we'll examine, there are objections. One major objection is that consequences matter. Of course, it makes sense to only ascribe moral praise and blame to people for what they can control, namely our intentions. But our intuitions strongly insist that consequences are important also. Which brings us to consequentialism, and our next moral theory. Utilitarianism is a moral theory that focuses on consequences. It developed out of the 18th and 19th centuries, which were characterized by nearly global violence, social and political upheaval. There were revolutions throughout the Western world, and during this chaos, people began to think differently. Against this background, Jeremy Bentham's new conception of morality had a powerful influence. But the origins of utilitarianism can be traced back further to Epicurus in ancient Greece, who followed an interesting kind of hedonism that influenced Bentham. For Bentham, morality was not a matter of pleasing God or the king, nor was it a matter of faithfulness to abstract rules. Kind of a shot at Kant right there. Morality is nothing more to Bentham than the attempt to bring about as much pleasure in the world as possible. This idea would sound very enticing during such a long period of war, unrest, and revolution. Many people throughout the world were in pain. So what was Bentham's utilitarianism grounded in? Basically, human pleasure is the ultimate moral good. It is desired for its own sake, not as a means to any other end. Kind of contra Aristotle here. It is not merely instrumentally good, it is intrinsically good. Everything else is desired as a means to some other pleasure. Actions, therefore, should be evaluated by their consequences. On this view, opposed to Kantian ethics, intentions are irrelevant. It's all about the consequences. Bentham's guiding principle is often called the principle of utility. One ought to do that act which will produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's basically what we ask ourselves when we try to use this moral lens. Given the principle of utility, actions are right to the extent that they promote the most pleasure for the greatest number of people, and wrong to the extent that they promote pain. Sometimes you may have to sacrifice your own pleasure for the sake of the group's pleasure, what you might call taking one for the team. There are some primary precepts that come out of this for Bentham. For Bentham, all pleasures, whether animal or human, are equal. The happiness of one sentient being is no more important than the happiness of another. Pleasure and pain, for Bentham, are capable of quantification. He believed you could measure them somehow to determine what is the more or less moral action. When using Bentham's moral calculus, sometimes called the calculus of felicity or the Hedonic Calculus, there are certain things to take into consideration. You need to consider the intensity of the pleasure. How good is it going to feel? You also need to consider the duration. How long is it going to last? Then there's the certainty of it. How certain are you that this is going to result in a pleasurable or good outcome? Then there's remoteness. How far into the future is the pleasure? Fecundity. How likely is it that the pleasure will generate other related pleasures? Purity. If any pain will be felt alongside the pleasure or as a result of it. Think of a hangover. And finally, extent. How many people are going to be able to share in this pleasure? This last point is important for the concept of maximization. Utilitarianism is about maximizing. If you have one course of action and it's going to create pleasure for part of the group, that's the immoral action. You have to go with the one that creates the most pleasure for the entire group, if possible. That's maximizing. But that's kind of a tall order. Does that mean I'm not allowed to just go to work? Or do I have to go to work and drink on the job or take ecstasy to maximize my pleasure in working? That's not clear. Bentham got utilitarianism started, but what we're going to be more concerned about in this class is John Stuart Mill's reboot of utilitarianism. Mill disagreed with Bentham about measuring pleasure simply by quantity. Not all pleasures are equal to Mill. They have qualitative differences. Mill believed that intellectual pleasures are superior to bodily pleasures. Echoing Aristotle, since animals cannot experience intellectual pleasures, but only physical ones, human pleasure must be more important. In Utilitarianism, Mill wrote, "Better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." So how do we know intellectual pleasures are better than bodily pleasures? Mill says that competent judges agree. I can remember what I enjoyed before my education, and I know what I enjoy more after education. And someone that doesn't have education really can't dog it because they haven't tried it. Furthermore, bodily pleasure is fleeting. Intellectual pleasures are lasting. Let's look at Mill's argument for utilitarianism in standard form. Premise 1. The only proof that an object is visible is that people actually see it. Premise 2. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people actually hear it. Premise 3. The only proof that a thing is desirable is that people actually desire it. Premise 4. Each person actually desires happiness for themselves. Which gives us conclusion 1. Each person's happiness is desirable. And conclusion 2. The general happiness is desirable for the aggregate of all persons. And finally, conclusion 3. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to produce happiness, wrong as they tend to produce sadness. This is sometimes called the greatest happiness principle. We can see that there are some strengths to utilitarianism. Because it focuses on consequences, it gives us the flexibility to bend moral rules. It can explain why moral guidelines that work well in ordinary life must be broken when we're confronted with extraordinary circumstances. And we'll look at some examples. Also, it provides a good answer to why we should be moral. We care about morality because we're interested in making people happy. We want to see them flourish. And of course, there are some standard objections. First, there are other candidates for the intrinsically valuable, such as Aristotelian flourishing or the Kantian goodwill, maybe spiritual growth, and so on. Pleasure is not necessarily the single intrinsic good. Also, it downplays individual integrity and personal responsibility. Imagine stealing a test ahead of time so that everyone can cheat on the test and get an A. Of course, if you're only concerned with outcomes or consequences, then maybe integrity doesn't mean anything to you. If pleasure is the only intrinsic value, it also allows us to use people, which also works against our intuitions. That hurts. Comparing units of pleasure is also not scientific. How can you actually measure the pleasure of one person against the pleasure of another? And like I said before, maximization is a tall order. But lastly, one of the most problematic objections to this theory is the tyranny of the majority. Because what we're interested in is the greatest good for the greatest number, concern for marginalized groups is left out of the moral calculus. So, we won't really start testing these theories in depth until we get into our section on applied ethics. But let's try a simple example with the theories we've looked at so far. We'll look at these again when we get into our section on sexual ethics, but for now, this will work for clarification. Consider cases of marital infidelity. From the basic view, we start with relativism, and we can't say anything moral about it. But if we feel the moral impact of the behavior, we transition to the second facet of the basic view, consequentialism. From the basic view, therefore, we may condemn infidelity because it could hurt the spouse, that being the consequence. But we can only do so after we transition from being relativists to being consequentialists. From the perspective of divine command theory, let's use the Christian standpoint, or rather, a basic Christian standpoint. The seventh commandment forbids this, so it's immoral. Nice and easy, right? Of course, this will depend on your religion and your interpretation of it. Now, to the complicated one, Kantian ethics. In this case, the maxim we'd be acting from would be, whenever I have the opportunity, I should cheat on my spouse. Now, that would be a rule for marriage. Since marriage is supposed to be between two people typically entailing monogamy, this rule necessitating infidelity contradicts the practice of marriage, so it's immoral according to the first formulation of the categorical imperative. Obviously, if a monogamous practice has rules that require polygamy, then it's no longer a monogamous practice. So, the maxim constitutes a contradiction. So for Kantian ethics, marital infidelity is immoral. Now on to utilitarianism. Just like the second facet of the basic view, we're considering consequences. So the answer here is, it depends. We have to think hypothetically and compare potential situations. Perhaps the pleasure of the two or more people outweighs the pain experienced by the spouse. Or perhaps the spouse won't mind, never know, or even enjoy it. That's the difficulty with this view. There's no real way of knowing when pleasure outweighs pain. And this is an example of what we mean when we say that consequentialist reasoning is inductive. If the pleasure, happiness, or utility does outweigh the pain, then it's moral. If it doesn't, then it's immoral. Kant seemed to think that his view merely explains the common sense view. Though I may be mistaken, I think most people would say that marital infidelity is immoral. If I'm correct, then Kant had it right. It's interesting to think that Kant's complicated theory might be what's actually going on in the background of our minds when we're making moral decisions. But Kant's views on sex are complicated, and we won't go into those until we get into sexual ethics. In the meantime, reflect on these views and compare their results to your intuitions. If one resonates with you, I hope you'll explore it further.